Hello everybody, this is Ziggy Pixter here. So I wanted to create a short video basically covering my recommendations for the Halloween quests. As of 2025, I have some bad news. There really aren't that many quests, despite many being open, that I would recommend running. And I think the big problem with it comes down to one factor. In order to play the Halloween quests, you need to get some Halloween cookies. How do you do that? You need to kill enemies, and essentially the rates are pretty low in the lower difficulties, with it becoming 3 to upwards of 4 times more likely as you go into Ultimate, with a small boost currently as of this year to finding cookies when you run cookie quests in general. So, why is it hard to recommend cookie quests to run for this event, given that there's basically one listed out per area? The answer is simple. It's just really hard to get a return on value for both new players and honestly even veteran players. So I'm going to put this in the perspective of, you have never played PSO to this point. This might be your first Halloween series of quests ever. And honestly, my best advice, sad as it is to say, if you come across a cookie, it is probably better for you to sell the cookie. Right now, it happens to be going between 5 to 6, but of course, I recommend you always check the forums before you settle on a price. Getting those 5 to 6 photon drops over running the quest is almost always worth it. It's really sad to say, but it is true. You finding 2 cookies through your journey from level 1 to 80, or possibly more, depending on when it rotates in or out of XP week versus drop rate week, those PDs are going to set you up so much from the trade compared to what you can find in these quests. So unfortunately, the way to kind of view these quests are, if you are an established veteran player and you have a bulk load of them, there's a reason to run them. If you're a fresh character, fresh account, you just hit level 80, you're trying to get into Ultimate, selling 2 or 3 cookies can literally gear up your entire character to then get more cookies. So it's kind of a snowball effect. You have to get some traction going to turn it into an avalanche of value. So if you don't have that base value, this is a really bad time to use these cookies. And the problem with using the cookies too is that they are intended to be used in up to 4-player games. I recommend only running these in 4-player games if you decide to play them at all, with the intent being that there is a favorable boost to all sorts of drop rates, rare rates, etc., much higher than the weekly rotations. So while the odds are slightly more in your favor of getting items, more often than not, you're going to end up with a lot of dead runs. I just want to set that expectation right off the bat. If you think this is going to be the ticket to a big item, I will say maybe, if we're talking in the scale of many tens, if not hundreds of cookies. If you only have a handful, you're probably going to do much better trading it in order to get your mags or your weapons or whatever. But let's say in the event that you are comfortable with your character, perhaps you're approaching endgame of some sort, or maybe, you're looking to see if there's ways you could take advantage of it other than just pure photon drop value. What would my recommendation be if you're able to get a few and you have a group and you're able to kind of clear these quests at a decent pace? I basically listed on screen the order of the quests that I would kind of recommend. Keep in mind, this is from personal preference. This is not the end-all be-all. I'm going to go through a description of each very briefly, and in a later part in the video, we're going to go down to each individual quest in terms of gear, recommendations, etc. But this is just high level. First and foremost, the one I would recommend for people that are looking to gain a ton of levels, a lot of armor to sell, excellent area pattern weapons, and 4 different items that can roll with hit percentage, and an endgame item. I don't know why I wrote V502 there. Let me put that as limiter/adept. And that is the Pink ID Desert. These items, if any of them drop, are pretty good. If any of them drop with hit percentage, it's a lot of value. So the way I want to frame everything in context for pretty much any run that we do at this point is, how many other items of worth out of the 10 or so enemy types that are in an area will give you something good, or at least something that trades for more than one photon drop? How much are you going to get in terms of utility? How easy is it to trade? And my response would be, in regards to Pink Desert on Ultimate specifically, there are a lot of items that if you can navigate the trade channels, you could probably make your value back. However, these items are not necessarily endgame, quote unquote. So they're not quite account defining levels of items, which is why if you are not interested in things like Slicer Fanatic or a high hit Ophiel Seas or potentially a Kunai with hit percentage or a Guardiana, which would be the 4 items I'm mentioning there, veteran players that are not looking to go into the trade market might instead enjoy going into Tower with the Cookie Quest. So we go from Episode 4 Desert to Episode 2 Tower, with the intent being that these quests are some of the best quests to run Ubers. So the entire intent of these runs is to get something that is normally extraordinarily difficult and also potentially give some spare value as you play. Now, kind of same concept. Tower also has a great area weapon pattern. For those that don't know what that means, essentially, the better it is, the higher the numbers of the pattern, the more likely you are, or even have the ability to receive 100% hit items. So from the standpoint of, there are a lot of potential high spin to win value from Desert and Tower from having extremely good patterns. I would say the closest I would recommend in terms of general value might be playing Purple Tower for Heaven Punisher or the V502 units, both of which are either very big utility items or mandatory for runs in the case of V502, which is not a bad pickup for players that are able to very easily handle the endgame areas and are just looking to kind of gear up for other types of runs. I will note that for people looking for Seal J Sword or the Psycho Wand, you could play as Aran or Psycho Wand and Skyly for Seal J Sword respectively. And I think those are all much stronger options than any other area that you have access to. So even though people can, in theory, play Caves for Psycho Wand or play Forest Blue for Hilda Tour, I really, 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 really don't recommend that you do that over Tower. It is a waste of your time. The number of cookies you would need to balance out is somewhere in a 10-fold times worse chance of doing those areas, and some of the enemy counts here are actually better than some of the alternatives of the other quests. So I know, for example, Del Beaters or Del Biters, however you would like to pronounce it, in Seabed are a popular pick for Psycho Wand. I'm telling you, don't bother. There's not enough Del Beaters / Del Biters to kind of make up for that compared to just running Tower. It's just sad but true. So unfortunately, these two areas just completely dominate all of Ultimate. The value you could potentially get from this and the utility and or the ability to get good hunts from these cookies are unrivaled in these two areas. Honestly, I kind of just put some of the other areas as a reference because some other people do run these, but for the most part, you're really not they're just not even in the same tier. I'm sorry, not all quests are created equal. Maybe some of these quests, if Tower and Desert didn't exist, should be run, but as is, there is honestly no reason to do it. But if you're not looking to get massive XP from Desert, which I don't think I went into details, but I'll cover briefly here, Desert is a fantastic way to level your characters. You will get on average about 6 to 8 times more XP per minute than any other quest in Ultimate. It is the undisputed champion of leveling a character. We're talking to the point where if an average Ultimate quest gives you between 100 and 125, with some good XP quests being on the 200 to 225 kind of range for leveling an Ultimate, we're talking 800 plus XP comparatively. So it's one of those things where you just get so much inherent value from items you could sell in Tower or in Desert that you could generally make your money's worth, if nothing else, as a consolation prize, which also makes it kind of hard to recommend any other area that doesn't give you access to A combination of really good armors, which Desert tends to prefer armor drops to weapons, and just in general, honestly, really no reason to even discuss any other area other than those two. I will give kind of dubious value mentions at the bottom, but I do not recommend those very highly. Only because of the current state of the game do I even mention those. So, let's say that you're not able to clear Desert because you're still pretty early into Ultimate difficulty, but you want to potentially get some items to gear you up in order to handle the Ultimate difficulty. I will present to you two options. One would be doing Desert on very hard mode, which is actually pretty good value across the board. It has items like Heaven Striker Coat, potential Ignition Cloak chances, Congeal Cloak. It has Jaya chances, all these items which potentially can give you some photon drops, and maybe go a little above value per cookie used in a group. It's probably the only quest that can kind of do that in very hard mode. I really don't recommend pretty much anything else in very hard mode except for maybe Wilderness on the same ID, on Blue ID. But from that standpoint, if you're trying to gear up, as I said before, trying to get your first Heaven Striker unit in order to play Pew Pew Lasers on episode 4, it's a pretty good time to do it because at least you have one item in the drop chart in Desert that is potentially a big payday if it happens to roll well with hit. Otherwise, you have a lot of staple units and a lot of easy armors that are pretty much used throughout the lifespan of the game. So I would say in the kind of the break-even territory, if you're looking to do something other than Desert and Tower, which really by far dominate, I just want to be clear, they are at a completely different tier than most of the other quests. Wilderness is okay. Wilderness is basically just Crater West in terms of drops, so weapon patterns are not great. You're not going to get a lot of, 70 hits. You're not ever going to get 100 hits there on very hard or ultimate. However, Blue ID is pretty good in both areas. Ultimate Blue ID gets up to 4 items with hit percentage, sort of similar to Pink Desert. But just generally speaking, it will have less big paydays. So if you're looking more for Girasols, Jaya, and maybe also another chance at getting something like Limiter, I would say you could try it in Ultimate, but just be aware that if you're able to do Desert on Pink, there's kind of really no reason to do it if you're just looking for general value. But just consider that as an alternative if you get really bored of running those two quests. Otherwise, in terms of very hard mode, you're kind of taking almost ultimate level spins, where it can be kind of annoying to get select cloaks, especially if you're going for Divine Filter or something of that nature, and you need to get your Caduceus's or whatever. It could be just a thing you run every now and then just to pick up a few. Maybe you'll get lucky. Select cloaks in particular sell upwards of 16 photon drops, or they're used, as I mentioned just before, in the Divine Filter, all of which could be useful after you do a run through Tower and potentially get that Heaven Punisher. So just wanted to make mention of the value there. It's an easier quest than trying to do Desert, as long as you have some ability to lock down the Dorphons, preferably with Arrest or Seize in order to stop them from charging. Other than that, I would say there is some very dubious value in terms of running kind of alternate IDs in other areas. So for example, Desert, you could technically run for Heaven Striker, just so it's a slightly less atrocious run on Green ID or Red ID, with the only difference really being, do you prefer a Disco Brave Man on Red ID versus V101, with maybe a little consolation prize drop. The number of drops overall on both those IDs are so much lower than Pink ID, I find it very hard to recommend. I would look to yourself and say to yourself, how much do I value the photon drops or need one of these other items compared to trying to spin to win kind of things? Because if you're going to spin to win, I don't see why you wouldn't just do this in Tower, to be honest. But I will say at the moment, also of dubious value, Temple. Rambling May and Vivian are incredibly awful to hunt as of 2025 with the removal of CCC, RIP CCC. And without any real quest filling the void, these items are incredibly irritating to hunt for. So if you are interested in those, I would say try it. But this is kind of the I'm looking to complete a character versus I'm starting off the game versus would like to just use some Ubers to improve runs. So this is kind of a last resort with cookies. Otherwise, I don't really recommend running other quests. We're going to briefly now skim through some of the other quests. We're going to talk a little bit about gear you might bring into it, but I think that covers our general overview of what I would recommend on these different difficulties. So as chat could probably see, or in this case, the YouTube viewers can see, the intent for Forest is supposed to be Hildebeer. Please don't run this. I'm going to say not recommended. Run Grell's Ego instead. So until they get rid of this quest, I don't see a reason you should be grinding out Hildebeers by spending cookies. The value you'd have to get per drop is just way too high. So until this changes, I don't recommend this quest. I'm not even going to read anything else I put on the page. I don't recommend this quest. From the standpoint of caves, I'm going to say if you are really desperate, I'm going to recommend to you that you play MAE, I would say 1B, 1C. I guess you could technically also run it on 1A. Or just play Tower. In fact, you know what? I'm not even going to recommend that. I'm going to just say run Tower, honestly speaking. If all you want is a Psycho Wand because there's 70 lilies in the quest, the odds of getting that Psycho Wand are horrendously bad. We're talking about, you know, a 1 in 100,000 plus chance of getting it versus a 1 in 12,000 chance of getting it. Like, it is just so not even close. Even if there's 6 to 7 times the enemies, it's still better to run Tower. I'm sorry, I'm not very impressed with these. For mine as well, mine is actually not too bad. There's an okay amount of Sinnoh Reds in the quest for people looking to get things like V101 or Lamed Argent. I'm actually just gonna recommend you run the RBR or the Roggle Boost Road quests, or Episode 4 instead. Honestly, again, it's like these other quests have good drops. These quests aren't really awful to grind, unlike some of the other weapons. So I really don't recommend using cookies to get Lamed Argent either. Honestly, the Lamed Argent is probably one of the easier Ubers to get without very annoying resets. You have a variety of ways to get it, and there's support within the game mechanics to increase drop rate and rare rate. Please take advantage of that. Finally, you have Ruins rounding out the Episode 1 Halloween cookie quests. It is known for people that want to get handgun gold on White ID to fight the Chaos Sorcerers. Otherwise, you honestly have no reason to play this over anything else. It's not going to give you weapons that carry you through the game. It's not going to give you units that are going to carry you through the game. It is just abysmal. Please don't run it. Don't run it on Blue ID for Heaven Striker. Just don't run it. It's not worth your time. I'm sorry. Just like, it's one of those things where like maybe I'll make mention in the Google Doc a bit more about the Heaven Strikers, but I don't recommend it. So honestly, if I never update it, I don't really care. Honestly, from the temple standpoint, even this one I feel is kind of dubious to put in here. Even in my original notes, I said only recommended due to removal of good temple quests, which is kind of true. With the removal of CCC and MAE also in the anniversary quests, there's not really a good way to hunt it. So in theory, if you want to get the holiday rappies, at least there's a reason to maybe play this briefly, just to say that you've seen them. So my suggestion would be play Pink ID. You bring in preferably Cure Paralysis units to deal with lilies if you're a human or a Newman. You bring in Hell in particular. So preferably from challenge mode weapons, but it could also just be as simple as a Hell Ray Gun, or a very high level Megid if you're doing a discount version of the same run. And I would recommend freeze and or I would say paralysis. I think both work. You don't necessarily need both. It's a little overkill. But if you happen to have people that can freeze with freeze traps, that's probably good enough. If you don't, you can bring paralysis. It's a run that is very heavily favored for hunters and rangers just due to the resistances in episode 2. So if you want to have fun, I would recommend probably supporting as a Hunawarl or a Ramarl and using some combination of Hell, Paralysis, or Freeze, depending on your character type and access to things like traps, over running a Force here. Now, from the standpoint of value, as I said before, a little dubious. I will make note for people that have been following or not necessarily following closely some of the changes to the drop charts. The intent this year is for rare lilies and rare rappies to always drop their intended drop in addition to the holiday drop. So technically, you could get 2 items from the holiday rappies now, which is kind of nice. So it tries to add just a little bit of value back into Temple. But again, just be wary of it. A big reason I didn't mention Spaceship is that, honestly, if you are looking for a Daylight Scar, please just run. Please just run episode 4 for Daylight Scar. Honestly, just run more Yellow ID episode 4. You do not need to spend 5 cookies of value for like a 3rd or 4th best weapon on a character. If you really want Lavis Cannon, you could do that in Tower. like there's so many things you could get here that just don't make sense to do. So you're going to see this on basically every quest, unfortunately. And as I scroll down, for example, we have access to, after Spaceship is Jungle. Jungle has an okay splattering of things. It technically also has a decent amount of Spiggles. So, like, I will say, like, in general, you know, you could farm the Sinnoh Spiggles, which I believe there are 18 of in the quest, for Skyly, Heaven Punisher. But overall, there's not really a reason to run this over Tower. There's more chances of Heaven Punisher in general from doing Tower. And the rate is almost twice as good. I mean, we're comparing what I think is, if I scroll slightly down, 15 drop chances to 18, but the drop rate is almost 50% worse. So it's still better to fight Mary Carroll the Tower than it is here. And I think that's just extraordinarily unfortunate. I'm just gonna triple fact check myself real quick to make sure I did not do it. I'm sorry. I lied to you. I was thinking of the barrels. So if the Spiggles are only 15. This is why we fact check ourselves. So I think from that standpoint, there really is just no reason to use it. So for people that are not aware, let me open this up for the group real quick just to prove a point. If we take a look at some of the drop rates in comparison to each other, see the Heaven Punisher rate is 1 in 22,000, where if we look at the Mary Carroll, scroll down over here, it's 1 in 12,000. So it is just literally, there's just no reason to run this particular quest over the alternative of Tower. And this is kind of the problem with the majority of these quests, where even though like they in theory have something that's really good, Tower's right there. Like, it just, I just don't know what to tell you. I don't know if they really thought about this from a design perspective, but the fact that one quest basically overshadows everything else in the entire episode, I think speaks volumes to kind of how underwhelming these other chances are, given the fact that cookies are a kind of hard to find item. And I think that kind of defines it a bit differently than the other events as well, and a small tangent here. Just from the standpoint of we don't really have the ability to free pick. Like, you have to hard commit and say, I'm going to spend time to this versus, oh, I'm bored. Here's another option to do something because I don't want to do Tower. You don't have that luxury unless you're literally swimming in the Halloween cookies. Which at that point, if you're swimming in that many cookies, you wouldn't be doing these runs. You would just buy those items at an auction. So I feel like these quests by design are kind of a failure, if I'm being frank and honest with you. I hate to sound kind of negative with it, but this is also kind of what I'm talking about. Like, another example with Seabed, where Delve Fighter / Delve Eaters, there's 14 of them. oh look, there's 18 Gibbles in tower. There's literally 4 more chances at the same drop rate to get an item of value from things like Cycle Wand over just doing Blue ID. So you see what I mean? It's just one of those things where I wish the quests were a little better. And honestly, if you really just want to do Blue ID runs for Seabed, just wait for like RBR, Phantasmal World 3, or Lost Charge Vulcan. Both of those are more likely to give you it in general, and will not cost you the equivalency of a limited ticket to a big thing of value, unlike playing these other quests. Now, we're going to briefly talk about the difficulty. We've been skimming through it since almost literally nothing has been recommended up till this point. So I will skim very briefly back to another page to give some context. So I am in the middle of developing a difficulty scale. I will try to keep this very brief as it is very work in progress. But the intent is that you start on a scale of 0, where people that are coming in literally at level 80 can do the quest. This is mostly reserved for very hard mode quests, versus 1 star up to 7 star difficulty, depending on the difficulty. So think of 1 star being kind of your easier forest quest, 2 star being mostly cave quests, or potentially very mini-boss heavy forest quests, comparatively needing a slightly higher stat requirement in order to clear efficiently. So, while we've talked about maybe doing some 2-star ones where honestly all you really need is attack accuracy to land your specials in order to delete most of the enemies, arguably you might not even need that much ATP for Temple specifically, with the ability to wield things like demons to substitute for bad ATP. But from the standpoint of you have a somewhat easy quest in the holiday quest for Temple, which is again not as recommended over the others, compared to nearly end of the game. So one big problem is that tower is very difficult. I don't recommend that you go into this tower quest without basically max stats, or you are in for a beating. And I mean, your ATA is maxed, your attack power is maxed, you have things that boost your accuracy. If you're a ranger, you should be using things like Ranger Wall at minimum. Potentially, you could be using ATP boosters as a hunter to help qualify for extra damage, like a Kasami Bracer. It's not required for you to get like the level 180 red ring in order to do well here, but it does help. These kinds of runs are definitely difficult. So tower runs are definitely meant to be for veteran players. So I just want to be very clear. Temple, with enough debuffs, some demons, and maybe one slightly skilled player in terms of stats and equipment, you know, being a little above average, they can help carry you through Temple. Tower, most players need to be very strong. If you're playing more of a supportive role, you at least need to be able to land your shots. So you are probably going to need hit percentage on basically every weapon that you have. So I've written additional notes here. I'm not going to put you to sleep reading through each of these notes one by one. That is basically just the overview. A very big difficulty jump for tower. So I recommend, from the standpoint of gear, that you bring things that can easily do demons. Now keep in mind, for demons specifically, there are many different things that can cause you to use demons on enemies more easily than others. Particularly the accuracy glitch with things like Slicer of Fanatic and Demon Mech Guns. Allowing you to kind of bypass some of the hit percentage requirement from landing. Otherwise, the minimum I would recommend would be a 50 hit variant of ray gun, laser, or even Bringer's Rifle, in order to at least land something to reduce the health of very high defense targets like Epsilon. Ideally, you should be using things like Demon Mech Guns, or maybe even Demon Needle, depending on the setup. But from the standpoint of the quest, just be aware that this is really only recommended for I am done with the game level characters. I am looking to go for very specific hunts to showcase that I have acquired all the required gear to clear the hardest content in the game, minus maybe some Ubers, aka items with ridiculously low chance of drop, and for the most part are more for show than utility. So I've listed out some items here that you might hunt, but we already talked about the main IDs a moment ago in regards to running RN for Cycle Wand or Purple in order to get Heaven Punisher and V502, You could kind of go for a general value run of White Ale as well, but I don't recommend that as much. I just kind of put that in there as a comment more than anything else. And finally, to wrap up the quest for ultimate difficulty, we have Wilderness and Desert. I would say from the standpoint that the existing, I would say drop tables for Blue ID are fairly solid for ultimate. The main thing that kind of brings this quest down are the weapon patterns. And honestly, that's kind of it. If the weapon patterns were just a little higher, if this quest ever gets changed from Crater West to Crater Interior, for example, that would open up some interesting options to boost the weapon patterns by playing Anguish. Unfortunately, as it is, it's a little bit of a harder sell for, you know, getting your Jaya, Girasol, Limiter, and Asteron belt. I would say from the standpoint of Endophiel-Seas, excuse me. I would say from the standpoint of trying to bring out a little value, cookie quests, generally speaking, you don't really want to swap out IDs, but if there was a cookie quest that you should maybe consider for ID swap, with agreement of everybody before you start that this is what you're doing, technically, you could try to run Blue ID and substitute out Blue ID as the primary ID and swap it into Viridia to try to get an Excalibur. Do I recommend doing that over just completing the run? Probably not. I would say at your discretion. Be aware that you can do it. It's probably the only time you might consider doing it. So, for example, if you're not as interested in Asteron Belt, you could try to get a Lame to Argent comparatively. So you could kind of quote-unquote upgrade it, but I think Blue ID is solid enough to run on its own that at least there are multiple weapons that could sell for a PD or so and have utility in endgame like a Girasol and or end up being very useful at high hit percentages like Ophiel-Seas and Jaya. But the final point I'm just going to state here, and again, I've written it here in bold because I want to make sure people skimming the guide or skimming the video do not miss this. Desert is the absolute king of XP. You are not going to find any better XP. It's just so fast. You clear it so quickly with a combination of demons and freezing bad Gorons and Goron detonators, etc. that it's really easy to catch up in levels to do some of the harder runs. So this is an example where 2 veteran players can probably carry some newer players. I would not recommend fresh characters to enter this area. So to kind of briefly go back into the star difficulty, I would place this a little above, you know, being able to survive ruins in terms of desert with the wilderness or the surface / Crater West quest we just mentioned a moment ago being a slightly more doable version of ruins. They're still roughly about the same difficulty in terms of how much raw ATP I would recommend you go into a quest and how much accuracy you would need in order to shoot down things like zoos. But just be aware that for that transition from 4-star ruins difficulty to kind of 5-star endgame area, if you're playing ATP, you really need to make sure that you are basically capped on nearly everything if you're going to go into it. You could supplement it a little bit by using demons on normal squads, but I would recommend to use items like your Slicer of Fanatic on creatures like Gertabulu in the desert in order to clear them fast. Just be aware that if you're more patient with it, you're more likely to get away with clearing since the level ups here are kind of crazy, meaning that if you're a slightly lower level cast, maybe you're in like the 130, 140 region, and you're attempting this for the first time, you might end up getting a lot of trap resets as you play. So you might enter the quest with 14, maybe 16 freeze traps, and then halfway through, you level up on a quest and you're able to freeze trap again. So in some weird ways, being lower level can be more beneficial when you play specifically Episode 4 Desert, just due to the fact that you were leveling so quickly. So I just want to point that out as a comment, that this is kind of like a exception to the rule, where weirdly sometimes lower level casts can do well, not from a damage standpoint, but from an absolute lockdown shenanigan standpoint. Otherwise, I would say from the standpoint of clearability, if you go through and you clear episode 4 Crater using potentially Divine Punishment, which is a special you get from Heaven Striker unit or Heaven Punisher itself, or just playing a group of forces. I think a group of all 4 forces are pretty strong here, with a little bit of lockdown, as I mentioned before, with Paralysis. The same thing can mostly be done in Desert, with the exception being that because Girdabulu is a bit easier to hit than some of the other enemies, it's actually easier in some ways to land some of the demon specials to kill big enemies over Wilderness, which is a bit odd because overall Wilderness is easier to clear in terms of ATP standpoint and also just raw tech damage compared to Desert. But it is kind of funny that some of the mini bosses just absolutely melt in Desert if you have an item like Slicer of Fanatic that drops on Pinkle ID. So who knows? Maybe if you play the quest, you'll get the item you need to kill the mini-boss mid-run. Who knows? But from the standpoint, Pink ID honestly just has so much going for it. I will probably just slightly update the notes just to kind of spell out that you also get a V801 from the prior section, just to make sure from the standpoint of items. If you look at it, you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 items in the entire run that potentially are useful to you, useful to beginner characters, or potentially sell for value. So it is really hard to pass up playing Pink ID here. I think this is one of their best quests, period. And finally, now that we've covered all the ultimate quests, we have a very short section. And I'm gonna save you a ton of time and just say, don't you even dare think of playing it on anything other than episode 4. And that summarizes episodes 1 through 2. Don't you dare play it for value, because you will not get good XP compared to episode 4. You will not get good drops. You will just disappoint everybody by wasting a cookie. But from the standpoint of Wilderness, or the Crater quest I mentioned before, enemies on very hard compared to ultimate are extremely susceptible to fire attack. It is to the point where if you hard focus Gafoi in this quest, because so many enemies spawn in one room, you could basically clear the quest just doing one spell almost the entire time, with maybe one other player focusing the other enemy types. From the standpoint of clearability, this quest is really easy. If you have any tech boosters at all, it is a pretty fast clear. If you are a fresh character account, you just hit 80 and you're a force. I would recommend getting together with a group of friends and spamming that fireball button, because man oh man, is this not a hard quest for forces. And honestly, Ranger with a good setup with the Divine Punishment, Pew Pew Laser, maybe they got a Heaven Striker quote from one of the very hard mode quests that we're going to talk about in a moment. Those also kind of decimate this quest very easily. So just be aware that there are a lot of chances of small value, which is why I think this quest is kind of a break even in terms of how much you might get back from the quest, with Select Cloak being probably your biggest payoff. Technically, I'm going to put Ignition Cloak. I'm just going to say very low chance to emphasize this. You could technically get Ignition Cloak in this quest. There's only 4 Rappies. If you really want Ignition Cloak, you should be playing Desert instead. But it technically has a lot of items that sell for 1 or 2 photon drops, and or are items that would be useful for newer players. So being able to get Heavenly Arms means that you're able to do specials more often in higher difficulties. You have Caduceus, which is used for things like Imperial Rod, or used as part of the Divine Filter. Cure Confused is an okay consolation prize from Dwarfada Declares if they happen to spawn. And Geocloak helps with supportive rolls to do extra frost damage. And there are 2 enemies with extremely boosted chance on one of them of getting a Photon Crystal. And those by themselves, will have a separate video on that, can end up spiraling you out of control in terms of value. So overall, pretty solid. Not like the most amazing quest ever, but it's nice. So if you find yourself not quite strong enough, like your mag is kind of lagging behind, you haven't taken up like a Rappy Beak to create a MST focused mag for tech casting, this is probably going to be an easier run with forces than Desert, just from the standpoint of HP and overall damage dealt by enemies is much lower in Wilderness compared to Desert. But just be aware that Desert in very hard mode is also really fantastic at getting you XP. So if you're kind of in that 85, 90 region of levels, you maybe played a handful of Wilderness and you said, wow, this is really easy. Maybe I should try Desert. Honestly, the answer is you'll probably do okay. Just be aware that, you know, if you can't deal with the Gertabulu, I would say you could probably use Paralysis. I'll think about it. You could technically lock them down with Paralysis in order to kill them, but honestly, on lower difficulty Gertabulu, I'm not even sure that's really required. I guess I'll put it here. So from the standpoint of ability to kind of clear the quest, the enemies are all really, really beneficial towards Blue Full ID. So we already talked about a majority of these items. So just be aware from the standpoint of value that basically one Heaven Striker coat equals the same value as a cookie. But unlike, I would say, Wilderness, even if you aren't going in the trade forums, getting your first Striker unit as a force does open the door for you to play Ranger on basically any Episode 4 quest, very hard mode or Ultimate. So it is kind of a crucial item to pick up, I would say, for people doing self-found. So I really don't want to undersell how good that is. That item by itself can literally pay for the run or open the door to having a whole different character build and way to enjoy these different episodes. Of course, I would say from the standpoint, the big difference between very hard mode and Ultimate is that the instant kill resistance or the dark resistance / EDK of enemies is much lower on Wilderness in very hard mode compared to Ultimate. So it is also possible as an alternative strategy, rather than using Divine Punishment or Text to kind of kill everything, that you can just hell targets down and kill them instantly. It's borderline whether this would work without at least a minimum of a V501 on some enemy types, but if you do happen to have something that boosts the insta-kill chance, you will probably be able to use it on 90% of the enemies that spawn in the Crater West / Wilderness quest. So just be aware that Hell is a somewhat viable option in multiple enemy types for Episode 4. You can also technically use it to kill some of the other enemy types in Desert as well, but since it's a bit less, I would say, consistent compared to doing it to Wilderness, it's probably better just to wipe them out with ATP, which is why I would say, you know, in terms of gear, in order to quickly clear them, it's going to be slightly harder, kind of more on pars of clearing at caves to do it fast, but in terms of survivability, you barely need to be above level 80 in order to do well. Just be aware that it is also a combination of minimum ATP. I will just very briefly touch on this again. So my recommendations would be, if you see these kinds of numbers in the guides going forward, these are the values you would kind of need to combo kill an enemy starting with about 1000 ATP. So my rule of thumb has always been to be at about 1000 ATP before you attempt Forest, with at minimum having around 193 to do normal heavies if you're willing to try to hit with more attacks with like a Charged Vulcan, for example, to kill an enemy. So just be aware it's not like a guaranteed success to kill at 193. You need a very strong weapon to justify only doing normal heavy there, and that's why you might need more ATP to compensate. Or for people that are using your Baran's launchers or your Charged Vulcans, normal heavy special will just kind of delete everything. So the better shifter level you have and the better quality of gear and the weapon percentage of items make these values very loose recommendations, just to be clear, but you really can't go wrong with the recommended score of about 1000 ATP, especially if you're playing Cast, who has no access to shifter. It will feel like night and day playing a game like that and potentially using things like 13 plus just a Brave Man, or just in general mowing everything down with Vulcans. Because honestly, you really don't need that much ATP to combo kill a single enemy. But as you go through very hard mode, I would just recommend that even though they don't hit for a ton of damage, it is imperative that you kill them as quick as possible in order to get your value back. So just be aware from the standpoint of very hard mode, you don't need a ton of stats to do well. If you feel like you are getting bullied a bit harder because you're playing maybe a force with low HP, I really recommend wearing your dragon HPs at minimum, preferably stuff like heavenly HP, or consuming HP materials as you play in order to survive some set damage. So I think from the standpoint of Halloween quests, we basically went over everything. I will just kind of say, unfortunately, the range of quests that I'm recommending are incredibly narrow, just due to the fact that you don't really have free reign to choose what you want without paying a cost. And also, to be clear, when I talked about paying a cost, it's one cookie for the whole team, not per person. Just want to emphasize that. I wrote it down. I don't think I said that. I'm just going to emphasize that there. So if you have 4 players, you only need 1 cookie. But just be aware that due to these limitations, the inability to quickly make the game and then potentially leave really dissuades the use of the ID swapping, or basically going through as a second player ID and attempting to get rare items. So just be aware that while you can in other quests normally swap out, I don't super recommend it. I'm going to leave this on screen very briefly, even though it is not in my recommendations for those that are curious. We'll cover this in a different topic, in particular as we talk about very hard mode and ultimate in other videos. But from the standpoint of Halloween, sad to say, I really hope you like episode 4. Because otherwise, most newer players are probably not going to get a ton of value out of this outside of directly exchanging the cookies for gear in order to hunt. So to kind of put it in one last perspective, selling 2 cookies would be strong enough to get a mag. So from the standpoint of, oh, and also a charged Vulcan and some other minor accessories like Heavenly Battle, just to be clear. But hitting like 1,000 ATP is not a really big deal when you could sell potentially 2 cookies or use what you have saved up, because a mag might grant upwards of 300 ATP. So over a third of the ATP required, in particular for Rangers, this gets closer to half actually, is completely covered by the sale of a cookie. So find a few of them, probably sell them, gear up, then you'll be able to kind of conquer those quests as intended. I don't recommend coming in here as a fresh character, since most quests are genuinely not worth running for you. It is better for you to get the gear first and then challenge a slightly harder area than it is to try to find the gear using the cookie without having some damage in the first place. So I think I've emphasized that enough, so I'm going to cut myself off here. So from the standpoint of Halloween 2025, that has covered everything. Please be sure that if you are viewing this outside of 2025 to always check what the latest updates are on drop rates for the Halloween cookies. They do change a little bit from year to year. Be aware also that at the time of this recording, forecast bonuses and anguish bonuses do stack with the cookies themselves. So I would say, depending on your group power level, if you're playing with an extremely endgame team or a group of very capable challenge mode wielding people, I would say from the standpoint that it might even be worth playing Anguish 1 for most of these quests that are not tower, in order to squeeze out a little value with an increased rare drop rate and also increased chance of photon drops and also more XP, since you're not going to be able to repeat the quest, which is usually the benefit of playing a cookie quest. Is if you're going for the one and done, you might as well as make that one quest kind of worth it. So just be aware it's a slightly different mindset compared to other event quests that you are free to replay at your leisure. And generally speaking, if you are trying to get things like cookies, please stick to quests with high enemy density in the meantime while you're trying to find these cookies. So consider quests like your Terrell's Ego, your Rescue from Regal in episode 1. If you have strong party members, you might consider Exerd in order to clear things. And maybe if you have a lot of challenge mode weapons, you might do Massive Attack 2B in episode 2. Or generally speaking, you could try some endless episode 1 and 2 while just casually playing to stay in a group in order to get more cookies. But generally speaking, Terrell's Eco massive attacks are a very safe choice in terms of getting clears and still getting items. So perhaps we'll cover that, I would say, in a different video, since it applies to more than just the cookie quests themselves. So just be aware that we're planning to talk about some very hard mode runs in the future. So look forward to that in a lot more detail in upcoming parts. But for now, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great time in the event and all future events as well.